I hired her in October. My mother had been unwell since my father died, not in body, but in the particular way grief takes hold of a person who has been loved completely for 30 years, and then wakes to silence. She stopped eating at the table. She stopped walking to the window in the afternoon. She sat in the blue chair by the cold fireplace and read the same pages she had always read, but her eyes moved too slowly, and I knew she wasn't reading. The doctor said she needed company, not medicine. Company. That was a word I did not know what to do with. I had the estate to manage. 3 farms under tenancy review, a disputed boundary with the neighboring land that my father had let lie too long, a roof on the east wing that had needed replacing for 2 winters. I could not sit in the blue chair with her all morning. I had tried. She knew I was watching her when I should have been elsewhere, and it made her worse, not better. She would say, "Go on, James. The land doesn't manage itself." And I would go, and she would return to the slow pages. So I wrote to an agency in Bath. I asked for a companion, educated, quiet, capable of reading aloud without making it a performance, someone who could sit with my mother without filling the room. The agency sent me 3 names with brief descriptions. I chose the third. The letter said she was 23, recently employed in a similar post that had ended when the family moved abroad, and that she was considered by her previous household to be reliable, perceptive, and unobtrusive. Unobtrusive. That was the word that decided it. Her name was Catherine Marsh. She arrived on a gray Tuesday with a single trunk and a satchel and no maid of her own. The carriage from the village dropped her at the front gate rather than the door because the driver had misunderstood the address, so she walked up the gravel drive carrying the satchel herself, and the trunk was brought up later by one of the stable boys. I watched her come up the drive from the library window. She walked steadily. No hesitation at the size of the house. No looking up at the facade the way visitors sometimes did. She just walked up the drive and knocked. Mrs. Holt brought her in. I came down from the library. She was not what I had pictured. I had pictured someone older, somehow. That word, unobtrusive, had given me an impression of a person who had made herself small over many years. She was not small. She stood straight, dark hair pinned simply, a dark gray traveling dress, hands folded in front of her. She looked at me directly when I came down the stairs, and she said good morning, without any of the anxious formality I had come to expect from hired staff in new houses. I said good morning. I showed her to my mother's sitting room. My mother looked up from the blue chair and said, "You must be Miss Marsh," and something in her face settled slightly, the way it hadn't settled in months. I did not understand why. I left them together and went back to the disputed boundary. By the time I returned for dinner, my mother had eaten. I did not see Miss Marsh often in the first weeks. That was by design, mine, and I think hers. Her role was with my mother, not with the household at large. She took her meals separately when my mother rested. She walked the gardens in the late afternoon while my mother slept, and I was usually in the east fields or the study at that hour. So we passed each other only occasionally in the corridor, at the foot of the stairs, once in the library when she came to return a volume my mother had finished. She was quiet in the way I had asked for. She did not fill rooms, but I noticed gradually that she was also precise. When she recommended a change to my mother's routine, shorter walks, earlier dinner, the fire lit before the hour she usually asked for it, she mentioned it without ceremony, as a practical observation, not as a request for approval. She did not second-guess herself in front of me, and she did not try to impress me. She simply told me what had worked and what hadn't, and then she went back to her work. My mother improved, not quickly, but the slow pages became real reading again. She began to come down for dinner twice a week. She asked for her needlework, which had sat untouched since spring. One afternoon, I passed the sitting room and heard my mother laughing, a small laugh, quickly over but real, and I stood in the corridor for a moment before I moved on. I was grateful to Miss Marsh. I told her so, briefly, in the entrance hall one evening, when we happened to cross paths. I said, "You've done her a great deal of good," she said. "She's done herself the good. I've only kept her company." And then she went upstairs. I thought about that for longer than was necessary. It was my mother who complicated things. In December, she began to improve more visibly, dressing for dinner every evening, resuming her letters, asking for visitors. She no longer needed Miss Marsh by her side for every hour of the day. She began, subtly, to change the arrangements. Miss Marsh's afternoon walks were longer now because my mother insisted she take the fresh air properly, not just around the garden. She recommended more than once that Miss Marsh take her dinner with the household rather than separately, since it was absurd for a woman of her education to eat alone in a back room. She began asking me in the evenings whether I had spoken to Miss Marsh that day and what I thought of her opinions on various subjects, which my mother then summarized with an approving air that I found difficult to interpret without becoming uncomfortable. I asked my mother once, directly, what she was doing. She looked at me over her needlework with an expression that was entirely innocent and entirely knowing at the same time, and she said, "I'm enjoying her company, James. Is that a problem?" I said no. I went back to the East Wing estimates, but I began to have dinner with the household more regularly. That part I did not examine. Miss Marsh ate with the household and said little at first. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was specific, a response to something said, an observation that added something without dominating. She did not perform conversation. She did not try to make herself pleasant in the effortful way that guests sometimes did. She was simply present, and present in a way that was different from anyone I'd eaten with in a long time. There was an evening in January when the topic of the disputed boundary came up. One of the tenant farmers had mentioned it in the village, and the story had reached the dinner table through Mrs. Holt. I explained the situation briefly. A drainage ditch that had been dug on what I maintained was my land, a neighboring landowner who disagreed, a survey from 30 years ago that was ambiguous on the critical point. Miss Marsh asked one question. She asked whether either party had records of who had maintained the ditch historically, who had cleared it, paid for clearing, arranged repairs. Because maintenance over time, she said, often established a practical boundary in cases where the original survey was unclear. I looked at her across the table. I said I would look into it. The maintenance records were in my father's old estate books. She was right. The case resolved in 3 weeks. After that, I asked her opinion on things more often than I strictly needed to. February was cold, a hard frost that lasted 10 days and kept the household largely indoors. My mother's health held, but she rested more. Miss Marsh had more hours unstructured. I found her in the library twice, once reading by the window, once examining the maps my father had kept in the lower cabinet. When I came in, she looked up without alarm and asked if she was in my way. I said no. I sat at the desk. She went back to the maps. We did not speak for an hour. It was the most comfortable hour I had spent in that house since my father died. I did not say that aloud, but something had shifted, and I was beginning to know it. I noticed when she was not in the room. I noticed when she was. I noticed the precise way she considered something before she answered, the small pause, the slight focus in her expression, and I began to look for it, that pause, as if it were something I had been given and not simply observed. I also noticed that she was careful around me, not cold, not formal, but careful. The same precision she applied to everything. She applied to the distance between us. She was always exactly as warm as was appropriate, and no warmer. She did not linger in conversations. She did not initiate them. If I sought her out, she answered readily, but she did not seek me out. I understood why. She was an employee in my house. The distance was correct. She was protecting herself, and she was right to. That understanding did not make it easier. In March, my mother took me aside after dinner and told me plainly what I'd been refusing to say to myself for 2 months. She said, "I'm well, James. I've been well for some time. I don't need a companion anymore." I said, "I know." She looked at me steadily. She said, "Then you know what that means for Miss Marsh's position." I said nothing. She let the silence sit for a moment, and then she said, "She knows too. I haven't told her, but she knows. She's been preparing herself for it. She's been slightly more formal with me for a fortnight. She's getting ready to leave." I said, "Where would she go?" My mother said, "That depends on you." Then she picked up her needlework and said nothing more, and the subject was closed from her side, though it was not even slightly closed from mine. I did not speak to Miss Marsh immediately. I tried to think through what I intended to say, and I could not find a version of it that was anything other than what it was, which was that I did not want her to leave, and that I had not wanted her to leave for a considerable time, and that I had arrived at this realization through no particular moment, but through the accumulated weight of 100 small ones, the boundary records, the cold library hour, the precise pause before she answered, the way she had said she had only kept my mother company, as though what she gave was nothing. It was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. But I did not know how to say that without saying everything else as well, and everything else was a great deal to say to a woman I employed. I found her in the garden on a Thursday afternoon. She was standing at the far end of the walled section looking at the bare rose stems. The frost had gone. There was pale, early light, the particular gray-white of late winter threatening to become spring. I walked down to her. She turned when she heard my steps on the path. She said, "Good afternoon." She looked at me with her usual steadiness and something else underneath it, a contained quality awaiting. I stopped a few feet from her. I said, "My mother says she's well." She said, "She is." "She's been well for some time." I said, "I know." She waited. I said, "I also know that her recovering means your position here has come to its natural end." She said, "Yes." A single word, level, prepared. I said, "I find I'm not prepared for that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "It would be easy enough to extend the position technically, but we'd both know it wasn't necessary." I said, "I'm not proposing to extend the position." She looked at me. I said, "I'm aware of how little right I have to say this. You've been employed in my household. There's a disparity in what I can offer and what you are owed in terms of freedom to refuse. I want to name that plainly so you understand that whatever you say I will accept without any difficulty to your situation here." She said nothing. She was watching me with that careful attention she gave everything. I said, "I would like to know whether you intend to leave because the position has ended, or whether you might stay for a different reason." A long pause. She said, "What different reason?" I said, "I'm asking whether you would consider staying as my wife." The garden was very quiet, wind in the bare roses, pale sky above the wall. She looked at me for a long time. I could not read her expression entirely. There was this steadiness she always had. There was something beneath it that I did not have a name for yet. She said, "You've thought about this?" I said, "For 2 months. Probably longer, if I'm honest." She said, "So have I." She paused. "Not about the same question." I didn't allow myself to think about the same question, but I thought about leaving, and I thought about what I would leave, and it became clear after a while that what I would leave was considerable. I said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "It's the truth." "Which I think is more useful." I said, "It is." She said, "Yes, that's also what it is." We stood in the garden for a while longer. Not much was said. The pale light moved. Somewhere behind the house, my mother would be at the window, and I was quite certain she knew exactly what had happened. And the thought of that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that the house was something other than a place I was managing. It was the end of winter. The roses were bare, and the ground was cold, and the sky was the particular color that comes just before a season turns. She stood beside me in the garden and said nothing, and I said nothing, and neither of us needed to.